Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here and delighted to pleasantly surprise and to discover the institute, 1990 Institute, because I had never heard of it before. And as somebody who's very concerned, like George is, on U.S. China relations, I'm always looking for organizations or events or activities that will help advance better understanding between China and the United States, because so much of it is really, as George said, was totally unnecessary, counterproductive, and oftentimes I think we shoot at our own feet. That's really, and so when Paul, asked me if I could participate in something like this, and I said, I'm really not an expert on China. I am not. China is not the target of my research. My research is first and foremost Asian American history and Chinese American history. And then secondly, yes, I'm very interested in U.S. China relations, the ups and downs of it. And then I'm also very interested in the study of the Chinese diaspora. Chinese are in nearly 200 countries in the world today. I mean, when the Libyan war broke out, guess how many Chinese had to be evacuated from there? Nobody knows that they were even there. 30,000. 30,000 were there. What about Mali war that just happened? Mali is going through election this week. And there were also quite a few thousand Chinese. Chinese in Nigeria, Chinese in Ghana, Chinese in Mauritius, and Reunion. These are all African countries. Chinese are everywhere. And I'm always very impressed in my study of Chinese overseas that Chinese seems to be able to survive and thrive under all kinds of weather conditions, all kinds of climate. I mean, there's in case you don't know, there's a research station in South Pole, and it's permanently staged. Of course, United States and other European countries also have those down there. And I think in a way, to the Chinese, survival has been the main focus for Chinese for several thousand years. And perhaps the Chinese people are so used to, to struggle for survival and try to thrive and do the best they can and are willing, to do just about anything. And I think this has been the history of Chinese overseas. Chinese could have dominated the world because Chinese were in many places before the European even arrived in all these former colonies, in the world. But Chinese did not colonize anybody. And the only soldiers that China has today outside of China were those soldiers, the UN peacekeeping force, whereas I think that we have over 150,000 soldiers stationed all over, and we have over 150 military bases all over the world in 150 countries. Why are we doing all these? And yet, we constantly said that China is a threat to our national security. Imagine if China were to do something in Cuba. Do you think America is going to put up with that? But it's okay for us to have all these islands and military bases. Of the 13 countries in Central Asia that eventually broke away from the Soviet Union, I think 9 of them have American bases now, and they're all on the western part of China that you never heard of. Of course, you heard about it during the Iraq and the Afghan war because we needed to use those bases as a supply line to support the military, and now we're in the process of decommissioning those military bases in Afghanistan. So, what I'm trying to say is that, and actually, I was asked to talk about the hot button issues. And I think it's fair to say that you have been hearing a lot of it since yesterday. I think all the speakers touched upon that. And so, what I want to do is still talk a little bit about that, but perhaps, a little bit different slant. Now, if you were to take a look at the history of the United States, China was really very forcefully present in our political consciousness only a few times. Okay? In the 19th century, it was, of course, Chinese immigration. Very important subject matter. When the Chinese first stepped foot here on California soil during the gold rush, immediately Governor John Bigler, in his re-election campaign in 1852, sent a very long message denouncing the presence of Chinese in California and why California must do everything it can to get rid of the Chinese. Not only to exclude them, but also to expel them from the United States. But at that time, California was like a voice in the wilderness in the United States Congress, because the East Coast, which was much more interested in trade with China and sending a whole bunch of missionaries to China, they certainly don't want Chinese to get upset about us closing the door, because we don't want China to close the door for trade and missionary works. So the East Coast could care less. But by the time when the Depression came around in the 1870s, the anti-Chinese message began to enter into the consciousness. And that's when the whole country, became very aware of China, and which eventually, led to the passage, as you know, of this first Chinese exclusion law in 1882. And just for your information, we passed, subsequent to that, an additional 14 Chinese exclusion laws. So the real repeal of Chinese exclusion law did not take place until 1965. So now, at the time, this is also something to put in perspective. In 1882, when the exclusion law was enacted, and the law essentially says that henceforth no Chinese will be admitted into the United States. Secondly, no Chinese who were already in the United States at that time, about 110,000 in the United States, will be allowed to become naturalized citizens of the United States. Now imagine in a democratic country, in fact, and we debated about, at the time when the Burlingame Treaty came around, we signed with with China. We debated about this issue at a time when we were also just finished debating whether the emancipated black should be given the citizenship and the right to vote or not. The Congress actually took an explicit step to deny the Chinese who were already in the United States the democratic right of the right to participate in the electoral process. And then the third one, a provision in the 1882 exclusion law, was to issue a kind of a certificate of residence or ID card to all those people who were in the United States at the time when the law was enacted, so that they could then take that ID and go back to China to visit their loved ones and come back to continue their business here. But there were 15 altogether exclusion law enacted, including the 1888 Scott Act, which, while 20,000 Chinese were visiting their relatives in China, Congress decided to invalidate it, the certificate, making it impossible for the Chinese to re-enter those 20,000 to come back to the United States, even though they held valid American government-issued certificates. And that, by the way, was the beginning of the Chinese trying to re-enter the United States illegally. And that, too, by the way, was the beginning of the Border Patrol, which was created not against, what Cesar Chavez called it the American Gestapo, Mexican, for the Mexicans, but actually it wasn't. It was initially created to actually prevent the Chinese from re-entering or enter the United States illegally. So that was the first time. The second time that the United States became very conscious was during the Sino-Japanese War. Now, for us, in our American history, we look on Second World War as the beginning date to be Pearl Harbor bombing in 1941. But for the Chinese, it actually began in 1937. In fact, some will even go back to 1931, when the Japanese invaded into a northeastern part of China. But Japan did declare war on China after 1937. And that, so while the war was going on, I think Americans became very bothered by the fact that here's our ally. Japan has always been America's junior partner in Asia to contain the polar bear. You know what that is, right? The Russians, to help the United States contain the polar bear. So we continue to support the Japanese invasion. A lot of military strategic material continue to be shipped to Japan, all the way to the eve of Pearl Harbor. We were still doing it. But in the meantime, American people became very upset about the brutality of this Japanese invasion into China. And so they've been mobilized, and then also the China relief, huge millions of dollars being raised to support Chinese. So Americans became very conscious of that. And of course, unfortunately, America have some ideas about what China ought to be rather than what China thought that they should be. And so the conflict eventually erupted into a civil war after the end of the Second World War in 1945. And suddenly we became very worried that, Mao Zedong is going to take over China, and our support of this great Democrat, Chiang Kai-shek, is a great Democrat and very sympathetic to of course, he turned out to be one of the most brutal dictators. And in fact, his favorite book was really Mein Kampf. And he wrote another book, sort of similar to that, called China's Destiny, which was a required text for all of us who grew up in China in the 1930s and 40s. Required text. When China got seized by the communists in 1949, Truman was, trying to explain to the Congress why we lost China, and of course Truman was, that's why he issued a white paper. But the interesting thing is that some congressmen heard that, hey, we hear that there's a really important book that is a required reading for all high school and college students in China, China's Destiny. Can we take a look at that book? You know what the response from the White House was? That's classified information. Why? Because it will make Chiang Kai-shek sound like he was a Hitler in that book. So that was another time when China became very important, because China became essentially the #1 enemy, and that's when we have the so-called containment of China policy by military, economic, and political means. And by the way, that is the basis for our justification and mistakenly into the Vietnam War. If you take a look at, for instance, all the testimony that was given in the Senate Foreign Relations, Fulbright's committee, always China is bent on conquering the world and taking over Southeast Asia. The domino theory was very prominent in our diplomacy. And so that period was McCarthyism, anti-China. China was #1 enemy. By the way, the Chinese American could not send any money back into China because that was declared by the U.S. Treasury to be trading with enemy. And several so-called Chinese American journalists and writers, activists who were sympathetic to the new China were prosecuted quite severely. Many, including some of my friends now, were denaturalized by our government, and some actually even sentenced to jail. Even though we support First Amendment right of journalism, the publisher and editor of China Daily News of New York Chinatown was successfully prosecuted under Trading with Enemy Act, and put in jail. One of them eventually committed suicide. So that's another time that we became very conscious of China. And of course, when Nixon went to China in 1972, that was too another very important period when we became very conscious of China until now. And I think I completely agree with George that we are now at a period where China has become very much seen as On the one hand, we say, oh, the rise of China. But you know, if you take a look, flip over the coin to the other side is not the rise. The other side is the threat of China. And China, of course, is brought home even more closely to every American on a daily basis. You cannot buy anything nowadays without seeing something called Made in China. In fact, some of the Chinese tourists who are now coming to the United States complain that they cannot bring anything back to China for their friends and relatives because everything that they buy is made in China. And that's true, including, by the way, the Bay Bridge, that is, you know, anything above the water, the seal, is coming from China. You know, and I thought, gee, you know, wouldn't it be interesting if at the ribbon cutting ceremony that we put a banner across the bridge, made in China, just to remind America how mutually dependent these two countries are now. So let me now talk about the what I'm supposed to talk about, hot button issues. But as I said, since most people have talked about it already, I will put a different slant to it. You know, first of all, I prefer to look at the hot button issues from two different perspectives. Is that we identify and define issue as defined by China, whether it be the government or the you know, scholars in China, the media, or China's microbloggers, of which there are over 300 million, more than the total United States population. You know, yesterday you heard about 500-600 million Chinese have access to the internet. Microbloggers everywhere, and in fact, news are coming out of that sometimes even faster than the official Chinese you know, newspaper and magazines. And so let me begin with you know, the issues that which is you've been hearing since yesterday, identified and defined by us in this country. First, of course, is that all Chinese are yearning for freedom because they have no freedom of speech, they have no freedom to practice religion, and Christians and Falun Gongs are being persecuted by China. That's the first thing that you hear all the time. Secondly, and by the way, in connection with the first point about lack of freedom in China, you know, dissidents in China become our heroes. And in fact, our media are more instrumental in creating heroes into American national consciousness than anybody. They are freedom fighters, they are martyrs, and of course, they are refugees dying to seek political asylum in the United States. That's the lack of freedom, that the cause of these rise of these dissidents. By the way, when you know, the first Chinese was to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature, Mr. Gao, when the announcement came from Sweden, even the literary scholars, many literary scholars from China, did not know who he was. You know, and the reason why Gao Zhenxiong had got the prize is because, first of all, he knew French. French was his field, actually, and he had translated a lot of French literature into Chinese. And then, in the process, some of his writing also got translated into French, and therefore accessible to the European. Otherwise, you know, like, you know, this last year, Mu Yan got it, the second Chinese to receive the Nobel Prize. Now, when it was announced, of course, hardly anybody in the West knew about who he was. And that's, you know, shows you why it's so important to take a look at who's defining what the hot button issues are versus, you know, China versus the United States. So the second one, of course, is that the Chinese were just dying for our type of democracy. One man, one vote with multi-party system. Actually, we don't really have multi-party. We have two-party system. Two-party system is virtually inscribed into our Constitution. Even a guy like Ross Perot, with his billions of dollars, could not get himself, started as a third party. So that's very important that the Chinese are dying for representative government they can elect to rule the country. And thirdly, Chinese are constantly fighting for human rights. The Chinese love human rights and they want it, and they are very much against the oppressive government. And fourthly, minorities, and just those stamps there, 56 minority racial group. We often think of China as maybe, okay, the Han Chinese, and then the rest are just Tibetan and Uyghur and no one else. When in fact there are 56, although the other 54 are pretty small. And China, of course, denied these minorities the right to practice their own religions, to maintain their own languages, and to retain their cultures. And China, was only interested in maintaining sovereignty, and to prevent other countries from helping Tibetans and Uyghurs to achieve independence and to become separated from China. And of course, China is very much against labor organizing, union. And in fact, one of the main lobby against China's import into the United States has been the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO has been, since the 1950s, under George Meany, has been very, very seen as being very anti-China, even though the labor movement in America, and which is really my big regret here, that American workers now belong to union has dropped to below 15%. Did you know that? Unions are losing, and the anti-union forces are so strong now that I'm afraid that the unions are going to have problems surviving in this country. But we also want very much for the Chinese to have the same kind of right to organize into labor union, because the Chinese workers were being exploited and poorly treated. And there's no question about that, the exploitation that's going on. Okay. And now the next issue, very controversial, and several speakers talked about it already. One-child policy. Chinese, because of this policy, Chinese were being subjected to all kinds of brutality, including forced abortion, infanticide, of course, basically denial of their human rights. And then of late, there's a lot of protests going on that you heard, not just a few hundred or a few thousand, but actually a few 100,000 a year of protests. And most of those protests had to do with forced seizures by government. And you just heard from Rousey that the land actually, at least legally, belonged to the government. Nobody owns land. Even when you sell your apartment or stuff, you are actually only leasing the land, because the government land belongs to the government, public control of land. And that's actually a very important element of what makes China a socialist country rather than a capitalist country. Although I also agree with Rossi that the way that it's being practiced, de facto a capitalist attitude about the private property rights. Because a lot of land is being seized arbitrarily from the farmers to build projects and for real estate development, and of course, very important urbanization process that's been going on, and we're going to hear a lot more, I think, in the next 10 years, because the current Prime Minister, who had just arrived at that office a few months ago, has declared that to be his #1 policy, more urbanization, because China is so far behind the rest of the world in the urbanization process. He thinks that China now is about 50% urbanized. We should be somewhere between 70 to 80% urbanized. So that means, of course, hundreds of millions of people are going to be moving into the cities. Of course, another hot button issue, occupational safety. China has been accused of a lot of faulty construction, and the Yinchuan earthquake a few years ago in Sichuan province, many school buildings and hospitals collapsed. And in fact, Chinese have a way of describing, call these buildings built on tofu. The foundation is tofu. That's why when a little shake, all the buildings collapsed and a lot of people died as a result of that. And of course, other safety issues like food safety, milk safety, meat safety, medicine safety. All these issues are very, very, they're very important, and the Chinese are actually quite aware of that. And then, of course, lastly but not the least at all, is the corruption. And you have corruption at all levels and all sectors of the economy, both public and private, and domestic and foreign. Everybody is into corruption in China. Okay, if you don't believe it, just ask all the major biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world what's going on in China. Finally China is doing an investigation into that. It's happening. So now, if you take a look at the Chinese side, now let me just say that if you were to just read, and that's all you read, by the way, in American media about what's going on in China, what the hot button domestic issues are, that's the list. You cannot really possibly go out of this list that I just gave you. It's going to be predominantly these. You have to wonder, what kind of country is China? Why would anybody want to live in that country? And you say, oh, no wonder maybe some Chinese want to seek political asylum. But that political asylum issue is long gone. Since China is opening up in the last 35 years, you don't hear much about political asylum anymore. But there are some. So what about the Chinese? How do the Chinese look at these hot button issues in China? To the Chinese for thousands of years, there are 4 Chinese characters that are most important to them. In Cantonese, 衣食住行, 衣食住行. 衣 means clothing, that you have something to keep you warm. 吃, be able to feed yourself, to prevent yourself from suffering from hunger, or even die of hunger. And before 1949, Chinese used to die by the millions every year, and nobody really gave a damn about millions of Chinese dying of hunger. 住, a shelter over your head, very important. And that's why, even the Chinese Americans, as soon as they save up enough money, the first thing that they would do is to buy a home, because somehow Chinese feel that you got to have 2 solid feet on the ground that belongs to you and a shelter over you, and that's some kind of security for the family. And the last one is transportation. Those 4 things are very important, and together with these 4 things, health care and education are also very important to the Chinese. And you heard about that already. Now, so that's the first point. What are the most important things to the Chinese? And you notice I mentioned nothing about freedom, about human rights, about election. Ordinary Chinese, I would say, if I may say so, could care very little about those things. And some of them probably don't even know what democracy is. I know that's a gross generalization. And the reason why I said that is that there are over 150 democracies in the world today, not 2 alike. You go to South Africa, you go to Israel, go to Japan, go to United Kingdom, anywhere, no 2 democracies are alike. There are Singapore is considered a democracy, but everybody knows that Singapore is a very authoritarian country. The only country, I've gone to China many times. I've looked at CNN and I buy all kinds of American newspapers and magazines and newspaper stands. But boy, you go to Singapore, I was so shocked the first time I went to Singapore in 1993 to give a talk. And before I arrived, I already got a couple of emails saying that now, when you arrive, there are two things that you should not say when you give your lecture. One is that you must not criticize the Singapore government. Secondly, you must not criticize the United States government. Like what I'm saying now could not be said, at least in front of the media in Singapore. And then I turned on the TV looking for CNN. No CNN. I asked the local people, how come there's no CNN? They said, oh, it's banned. And Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, also banned because they have written objectionable articles that criticize Singapore. That was, of course, in the 1990s. But Singapore is still a very, and I'm going to go there next month, at the invitation, by the way, of Singapore government to talk about bilingualism in the world today. Okay. So corruption is number one. Unlawful seizures of land, very important to the Chinese. One-child policy, but not for the reason given by the American media. The Chinese are more concerned about perpetuating their family name, having extra hands in the farm to help, till the land, and of course, old age security. Chinese children are expected to take care of their parents. When you have one-child policy, and now one child has to take care of 4 grandparents, how do you do that? 4 parents. Those are the primary concern. They're not concerned about the other stuff that we talk about here. A lack of confidence in the government. The minute the government ceases to be able to provide those 4 things plus healthcare and education, the government loses its legitimacy. The government loses the mandate from heaven that you have heard here before. And that's how dynastic change took place. And dynastic change will take place again. Communist or non-communist, whenever the government loses its legitimacy, that will happen. And of course, yes, people are very concerned about no rule of law in China, and very arbitrary, completely ruled by men. Widening income disparity. You have heard a lot about that already. Inequality between urban and rural, and of course, a word that has virtually dropped out of Chinese vocabulary in a socialist communist country, class struggle. Completely out of the vocabulary. I cannot believe it. In 1978, when I first time went to China, that's all you hear, class struggle. Class struggle against capitalists, against imperialists, against feudalists. But class struggle has, seems to have gone out the window suddenly. And the Chinese people expect the government to forcefully defend China's sovereignty and interests against foreigners. That is that is almost sacred to the Chinese people, and I think that has something to do with the history of the last 150 years. Of course, the reform of the household registration, hukou reform, very important, and we are going to hear a lot more, I think, under the Li Keqiang's administration. And of course, they want affordable housing, health care, and education, and political reform and social accountability of the government. Now, by political reform, they're not talking about democracy. In fact, a lot of Chinese scholars, political scientists have been talking and writing a lot about political reform. But democracy, as we understand it in the United States, no, that's not what the people were after. Now, let's just quickly take a look at one example, one-child policy, just to show how the difference. I already mentioned the difference. Now, the interesting thing that I find is that our federal court actually ruled that a Chinese woman can seek political asylum in this country if they want to have more than one child. Now, think about that. You know, China has about 600 million childbearing age women. And are we prepared to open the door for them to immigrate here and to have a lot of children in this country, as many as they want? You know, I remember before we normalized relations with China, you know, I had written a letter to President Carter in the White House at that time, and I said that, you know, it was time for us to normalize relations with China. It was about 1978 that I wrote the letter, or 77 or 78. And, you know, you don't expect anything to come from White House, a letter from a nobody. But strangely enough, Michael Oxenberg, who was then on the national security staff in charge of China desk in the White House, sent me a letter and said, you know, I'd like to hear your view, so come on over to the White House. So I took our flight and went over there, went through the security clearance and all that, went in there. And the first question that he popped to me was that, you know, President Carter is very interested in normalizing relations with China. But what do you think if we were to attach the Jackson Amendment as a conditions for normalization of relations? Meaning, you know, that Jackson Amendment was dealing with the ability of the Jews in Russia, in the Soviet Union, to emigrate freely out of Soviet Union, that we would do the same thing to China. You know, we presume that China did not want the Chinese people to leave, and there were evidence at that time. So, my response to knowing what he was getting at, I then went through a history of Chinese dealing with American immigration policy, some of the stuff, exclusion law that I talked about, for 150 years. You know, and I concluded my presentation by saying that the United States should be the last country to say anything to the Chinese about immigration. And so he then dropped the subject matter. Well, interestingly enough, January 1979, Deng Xiaoping came to the White House to normalize the relations with China. And at the White House banquet, Jimmy Carter was sitting next to Deng Xiaoping. And in the middle of dinner, Jimmy Carter leaned over to Deng Xiaoping and said, now that we are normalized, will you allow the Chinese people to freely immigrate? And Deng Xiaoping replied, how many do you want? Is 20 million a year enough? You know, Jimmy Carter immediately dropped the subject. So obviously what I told Michael Oxenberg was never told to Jimmy Carter, and so Jimmy Carter made a fool of himself. So as you can see, there are two ways of looking at every single hot-button issue, and unfortunately, we are getting a very slanted, biased view from none other than our New York Times.
Thank you very much, Ling-chi. Thank you. I want to ask